The war in Burma did not begin with an advance. It began with a withdrawal, long, uneven, and marked by confusion more than planning. In the opening months of 1942, Allied forces along the eastern edge of the British Empire discovered that the war they had prepared for no longer existed. What unfolded was not yet a story of bold operations behind enemy lines, but of collapse, uncertainty, and the urgent need to learn under pressure how to endure. After the attacks of December 1941, Japanese forces moved rapidly across Southeast Asia. Their method combined speed, surprise, infiltration, and strong air support. Well-trained infantry advanced along multiple routes at once, bypassing strong positions rather than confronting them directly. By early 1942, this momentum reached Burma. Defensive plans based on fixed positions and controlled movement were overtaken. Roads that had been meant to carry supplies and reinforcements inward now carried exhausted columns moving out. The campaign's early weeks exposed a deep imbalance. Allied strategy assumed control of space, while reality stripped that control away almost immediately. Burma's geography intensified the crisis. The dense jungle limited visibility to a few yards. Hills and narrow river valleys broke units into small, disconnected groups. Seasonal rivers flooded suddenly, turning planned routes into impassable obstacles. Tracks shown on maps disappeared into the forest or mud. For the British Indian Army, this terrain erased the idea of a clear front line. There was no continuous boundary to defend, only scattered positions connected by unreliable paths and fragile communication. Gurkha regiments were part of this larger force in retreat. At this stage, they were not operating as independent raiders or special forces. They were infantry units, moving alongside British and Indian formations, tasked with delaying Japanese progress long enough for others to escape. Companies withdrew through forest trails and hill paths, often unsure where the enemy was or whether friendly units were still holding nearby ground. Orders changed frequently. Situations evolved faster than messages could travel. The Japanese style of advance deepened this uncertainty. Instead of attacking defended positions directly, Japanese units slipped around them. Roads were cut, bridges seized, and supply routes severed before defenders realized they were threatened. A position might remain quiet for hours, only for its occupants to discover that the rear was already compromised. For soldiers on the ground, this created the unsettling sense of being surrounded without having been decisively engaged. Rearguard actions became common. Small Gurkha detachments were ordered to hold river crossings, ridgelines, or junctions just long enough to slow pursuit. These actions were not intended to win battles. They were measured in time gained, sometimes no more than an hour or two before withdrawal resumed. Ammunition was conserved carefully, casualties were avoided where possible. Movement, not confrontation, was the priority. As the retreat continued from January through May 1942, the limits of conventional doctrine became increasingly clear. Units trained for planned engagements struggled when orders changed daily, and maps could not be trusted. Patrols sent to locate Japanese forces often returned with only fragments of information: a recently used trail, an abandoned village, the distant sound of movement. Decisions were increasingly made by junior officers and non-commissioned officers, based on judgment rather than instruction. It was during these weeks that the first quiet adaptations emerged. Small patrols were sent forward not to fight, but to observe. Men learned to move lighter, carrying only what they could sustain. Noise discipline became instinctive. Listening mattered more than talking. Terrain was no longer treated as background scenery, but as an active force that shaped every decision. Knowledge of paths, water sources, and village locations, often gained informally, became as valuable as formal intelligence reports. These adjustments were not yet organized into doctrine. They were practical responses to survival. Units that adapted endured longer. Those who clung to rigid methods suffered heavier losses or disintegration. The retreat became a harsh teacher, stripping away assumptions and rewarding flexibility. The environment imposed its own heavy cost. Malaria spread rapidly among troops without proper protection. Dysentery weakened men already exhausted by hunger and constant movement. Rations intended to last days were stretched into weeks. Vehicles were abandoned when fuel ran out, or roads vanished into the jungle. Medical evacuation was often impossible. Official reports recorded these losses in clinical language, but for those experiencing them, the retreat was as much a struggle against illness and exhaustion as against the enemy. Morale did not collapse so much as narrow. Large objectives faded. Survival became immediate and practical. Reach the next river, find the next track, keep the unit together. Leadership at lower levels proved decisive. Small acts, sharing loads, enforcing rest, maintaining order in withdrawal, kept units from breaking apart entirely. By the time Allied forces crossed back toward India, Burma had been lost. Yet something else had taken shape in the process. The retreat had exposed hard truths about jungle warfare, mobility, and command. It showed that survival depended less on holding ground and more on understanding movement, space, and endurance. What appeared as a collapse was also a rehearsal. Because of this withdrawal, a different kind of war would emerge, one that no longer relied on fixed lines and no longer assumed the enemy would remain in front. The jungle had erased certainty. What replaced it was adaptation, learned under pressure, and carried forward into everything that followed. Survival, first learned through retreat, began to harden into a method. By mid-1942, as battered Allied units regrouped inside India, the British Indian Army faced a clear reckoning. Burma had not been lost only because the enemy was strong. It had been lost because the war had been misunderstood. The jungle, the pace of movement, and the nature of combat had been misread. If the campaign were to resume, it would require soldiers trained not merely to fight in jungle terrain, but to live and operate in it for long periods. The early months after the retreat were marked by reassessment. Reports from Burma were studied closely. Patterns emerged. Units that survived longest were not always the heaviest armed, but those that adapted fastest. They moved lightly, rested deliberately, and relied on initiative at low levels. These observations began to shape a new training approach, one that shifted away from parade ground precision and toward practical endurance. Across eastern India, new jungle warfare training centers were established. In Assam and Bihar, instruction replaced open drill squares with forested ground, steep slopes, and river crossings. Training moved away from rigid formations and toward dispersion. Soldiers were taught to operate in small groups, sometimes no larger than a section, without immediate support. The aim was to prepare men for isolation, uncertainty, and decision-making without constant supervision. Navigation became a central skill. In Burma, maps had often failed, and landmarks had disappeared into vegetation. Training emphasized compass use, pacing distance, and reading terrain directly. Slopes, vegetation density, watercourses, and animal paths were treated as sources of information. Soldiers learned to move with awareness rather than speed, understanding that a wrong turn could separate a patrol for days. Movement discipline was enforced strictly. Silence became routine. Equipment was stripped to essentials. Marches were conducted with limited rations to simulate real conditions. Night movement, once avoided, became a standard skill, despite its risks. Soldiers learned how easily noise carried in jungle air and how quickly exhaustion magnified small mistakes. For Gurkha regiments, this training did not rely on assumptions of natural ability. It imposed structure. Endurance was deliberately tested. Long marches under load, limited sleep, and repeated movement through difficult terrain. Fire discipline was drilled until it became automatic. Soldiers were taught that firing first was not always an advantage. In jungle fighting, remaining unseen often mattered more than inflicting immediate damage. The training manuals changed alongside these practices. Earlier doctrine assumed that supply lines would be maintained and that units would operate within a clear command structure. These assumptions were quietly discarded. New guidance accepted isolation as normal. Units were trained to expect periods without resupply, without evacuation, and without reliable communication. Radios were issued more widely, but their limits were emphasized. Batteries failed quickly in heat and humidity. Signals were distorted by terrain. Commanders were trained to plan for autonomy rather than constant contact. Orders were written with flexibility in mind, allowing junior leaders to adjust based on conditions rather than waiting for instruction. Gurkha units were increasingly identified for sustained patrol roles. This was not a matter of reputation or myth, but of organization. Regiments with strong internal cohesion, experienced non-commissioned officers, and disciplined routines adapted more easily to dispersed operations. Small patrols demanded trust between officers and men, and among the men themselves. In such conditions, authority depended less on rank display and more on shared habit and example. Cultural cohesion played a role, but training emphasized that jungle warfare rewarded professionalism, not background. British, Indian, and Gurkha soldiers trained together under identical conditions. The differences that mattered were practical: who maintained pace when exhausted, who could enforce routine under stress, and who could make sound decisions without waiting for orders. As 1942 moved toward 1943, training increasingly mirrored future operations. Exercises simulated long-range movement, days of patrol without contact, followed by sudden action and immediate withdrawal. Supply drops were practiced repeatedly, including the likelihood of missed zones or damaged containers. Medical training focused heavily on prevention rather than treatment. Anti-malarial discipline, water purification, foot care, and rest cycles were emphasized as matters of survival rather than comfort. Alongside physical training came a conceptual shift. The idea of a continuous front line was quietly set aside. Planners began to think in terms of depth rather than frontage. If Japanese forces could move through the jungle to strike behind Allied positions, Allied forces could do the same. The jungle was no longer seen only as an obstacle, it was becoming a space of maneuver. This change altered how operations were imagined. Instead of holding ground continuously, pressure could be applied selectively. Enemy movement could be disrupted without permanent occupation. Information gathered by small patrols could shape larger actions. This approach accepted uncertainty as unavoidable and sought to work within it rather than eliminate it. By early 1943, units that had retreated in disorder months earlier were being reorganized for a new task. They would not return to Burma as static defenders. They would move through it, sometimes beyond visible lines, operating in areas where maps were incomplete and certainty rare. The lessons of collapse had been absorbed, not as memory, but as method. Training ended not with a ceremony, but with deployment orders. Units were warned that conditions would be worse than those suggested. Supplies would fail, communication would break, success would depend on discipline rather than confidence. These warnings were not meant to discourage, but to prepare. As attention shifted eastward once again, the character of the war had already changed. The jungle was no longer an unknown force. It was understood as demanding, unforgiving, but workable. The retreat of 1942 had stripped away illusions. What replaced them was a quieter readiness, built not on bold plans but on habits designed to survive an invisible war. In the Burmese jungle, the idea of a front line slowly lost its meaning. By 1943, Allied planners no longer imagined the war as a clear division between friendly and enemy territory. Instead, the campaign was understood as a shifting pattern of movement, columns advancing, withdrawing, and reappearing in spaces that could not be permanently controlled. It was within this unstable environment that operations described as behind enemy lines took shape. The concept itself was not new, but its application in Burma was different. Earlier wars had imagined raids as brief incursions followed by a quick return. In Burma, long-range operations were designed to last for weeks. Units moved deep into areas held by Japanese forces not to seize territory, but to unsettle it. The objective was pressure rather than possession. By forcing the enemy to guard supply routes, protect rear areas, and respond to uncertain threats, these operations aimed to stretch Japanese resources and attention. These missions depended on dispersion. Columns moved in small groups, often separated by distance and terrain. Surprise mattered more than firepower. Endurance mattered more than speed. The jungle allowed movement without detection, but only if discipline was maintained. Noise, light, and careless contact could undo days of careful progress. Gurkha detachments were integrated into this system as part of larger formations rather than acting independently. Their role reflected their training emphasis on sustained patrol work. Small groups moved ahead of main bodies, testing routes, observing movement, and identifying threats. In practice, this meant operating for long periods without direct oversight. Decisions were made locally, based on limited information and immediate conditions. Behind enemy lines did not mean constant combat. Most days passed without contact. Patrols walked, halted, observed, and waited. Movement followed ridgelines, riverbanks, and forest tracks chosen for concealment rather than convenience. Villages were approached with caution, if at all. The presence of civilians introduced both risk and information. Signs of Japanese activity, a recently used trail, disturbed ground, discarded packaging, or cooking fires were recorded carefully and passed on when communication allowed. This kind of intelligence was rarely dramatic. It did not announce itself with explosions or captured ground, yet it shaped operations at higher levels. Patterns of movement identified by small patrols helped commanders understand where Japanese units were concentrating, where supply routes were vulnerable, and where pressure could be applied indirectly. The value of this information often became clear only days or weeks later. When contact did occur, it was brief and controlled. Ambushes were designed to disorient rather than destroy. A sudden burst of fire, followed by immediate withdrawal, created uncertainty and forced Japanese units to react defensively. Rail lines and roads were targeted selectively. not to shut them down permanently, but to delay movement and force repairs under threat. The aim was disruption rather than decisive engagement. These actions carried risk. Every contact increased the chance of pursuit. Every delay threatened supply schedules. Patrol leaders learned to balance opportunity against exposure. Not every target was worth engaging. Withdrawal was not failure, it was preservation. Supply was the most significant constraint. Once units moved beyond conventional lines, ground-based logistics no longer functioned. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, radios and batteries were delivered by airdrops to pre-arranged zones. This system was fragile. Aircraft missed drop points. Containers broke on impact. Supplies sometimes fell into enemy hands. Rations were limited, and weight calculations were strict. Patrols planned operations assuming shortages would occur. Water, often overlooked in planning, became critical. Streams were unreliable. Purification was slow and imperfect. Dehydration reduced alertness and endurance. These pressures shaped movement as much as enemy activity. Routes were chosen based on water access as often as tactical advantage. Japanese forces adapted as well. Counter-patrolling increased. Supply routes were guarded more heavily. Intelligence efforts focused on monitoring villages and trail networks. The jungle became contested not only physically, but also through information. Both sides operated with partial knowledge, trying to interpret signs that were often ambiguous. A broken branch could mean movement hours earlier, or days. Decisions were made without certainty. For the men on patrol, the psychological strain was constant. Isolation was normal. Silence was enforced for long periods. Communication with higher command could be lost for days. Decisions whether to advance, wait, or withdraw had consequences that could not be undone. Leadership at the lowest levels became decisive, not through dramatic gestures but through routine. Watches were set, rations were managed, rest was enforced even when anxiety urged movement. Time behaved differently behind the lines. Days blended together. The absence of clear milestones made endurance harder to measure. Morale depended less on optimism than on structure. Predictable routines, however simple, provided stability in an environment defined by uncertainty. By late 1943, these operations had become a regular feature of the Burma Campaign. They did not win battles outright, and their results were difficult to quantify. Supply delays, enemy redeployments, and reduced confidence rarely appeared on maps. Yet collectively, they altered the rhythm of the war. Japanese units were forced to defend depth as well as frontage. The jungle, once an advantage, became a source of anxiety. Success, however, carried its own danger. As patrols proved effective, they were pushed deeper. Distances lengthened. Evacuation routes grew more complex. A single injury or failed drop could threaten an entire unit. Each additional mile forward increased both impact and vulnerability. These risks were understood, but accepted. The alternative, allowing the enemy freedom of movement, was worse. The jungle demanded commitment once entered. Half measures were punished quickly. As patrols continued to operate beyond familiar ground, another threat began to dominate experience. It was not an enemy unit, and it could not be ambushed or avoided. It waited quietly in the environment itself, accumulating effect over time. The war behind enemy lines was about to become a war of endurance. The jungle did not need to attack to cause damage. By late 1943, as Allied units pushed deeper into the Chindwin Basin and surrounding regions, it became clear that the most persistent danger was not always Japanese fire, but the slow and steady erosion of physical strength. Men weakened quietly, energy drained not in moments of violence but over days of strain. Endurance itself became a weapon, and often the deciding one. Disease spread faster than any patrol. Malaria was constant despite strict precautions. Mosquito nets tore, repellent ran out, pills were forgotten or vomited up during illness. Dysentery followed contaminated water and spoiled rations. Skin infections spread in heat and moisture. Untreated wounds festered. Official medical records showed that illness consistently exceeded battle casualties in jungle units. Commanders understood this pattern well, but there were limits to prevention. Medical supplies were limited, and evacuation depended on air access that could not always be arranged. Food imposed another pressure. Rations were calculated carefully to balance weight and duration, but plans rarely survived contact with terrain. Supply drops missed their zones or shattered on impact. Some containers were lost to trees or slopes. Others fell into Japanese-held areas. Patrols learned to ration from the first day, assuming shortages would come. Meals became smaller and less regular. Hunger dulled concentration and shortened tempers. Discipline, not morale, kept units functioning. In these conditions, leadership shifted decisively downward. Non-commissioned officers carried much of the burden when officers were absent, ill, or killed. Their role was rarely dramatic. It was procedural and constant, enforcing rest when momentum tempted movement, ensuring water discipline, rotating heavy loads so weaker men did not collapse, and maintaining order when fatigue encouraged shortcuts. Small failures multiplied quickly. Small corrections prevented a breakdown. Movement itself became an exercise in restraint. Pushing too hard risked exhaustion and injury. Moving too slowly increased the chance of discovery. Patrols learned to pace themselves by terrain rather than by time, advancing when slopes allowed, halting during peak heat, and moving again at dusk. Night movement became common, though dangerous. Visibility dropped to nothing. A misstep could mean broken bones far from help. Evacuation posed some of the hardest decisions. Casualties could not always be carried without endangering the entire patrol. Commanders faced choices with no acceptable outcome: slow the unit and risk detection, or leave injured men behind with supplies and instructions. These moments were recorded in reports with careful language, but their impact lingered. Survival sometimes required separation, and those decisions were remembered long after operations ended. Isolation intensified every strain. Radios were lifelines, but unreliable. Batteries drained quickly in heat and humidity. Signals were distorted by hills and thick forest. Days passed without contact. In that silence, routine became essential. Perimeters were set even when no enemy was near. Watches were maintained. Weapons were cleaned. These actions were not signs of fear, but of preservation. Morale under such conditions did not depend on optimism. It depended on predictability. Knowing when to move, when to rest, when to eat, even if the portions were small, gave shape to time. Humor appeared rarely and briefly, often dark and understated. Reflection was a luxury. Focus narrowed to the immediate. The next ridge, the next water source, the next night without contact. Japanese forces faced similar environmental pressures, and they exploited Allied weakness when possible. Patrol clashes often occurred by chance rather than design. Two small units intersecting in dense terrain. These encounters were sharp and violent, followed by rapid withdrawal. Neither side could afford prolonged engagement. Ammunition was limited. Reinforcements were distant. Survival depended on breaking contact quickly. Over time, patterns emerged. Units that maintained discipline endured. Those who pushed too aggressively burned out. The jungle acted as a filter, rewarding patience and punishing excess. Experience mattered, but adaptability mattered more. Men learned not to fight the environment, but to work within its limits. By early 1944, the cumulative effect of these conditions shaped the campaign as much as any formal plan. Units capable of sustained endurance continued operating. Others were withdrawn or merged. The jungle imposed a quiet selection, indifferent to rank or reputation. Signs of change began to appear. Patrols reported increased Japanese movement. Supply trails showed heavier traffic. Intelligence suggested preparations for a major offensive. These signals were often subtle: a busier path, a new campfire site, discarded equipment, but together they indicated shifting intent. Those operating in isolation sensed the change before it was officially announced. The jungle felt different, less empty, more tense. Endurance had carried these units through a year of invisible warfare, but endurance alone would not be enough for what was coming. The shadow war of patrols and disruption was giving way to something larger, a confrontation that would draw these dispersed efforts into the orbit of a major battle. The weapon of endurance had kept them alive. Soon it would be tested against the full weight of an enemy offensive. By the spring of 1944, the war in the jungle narrowed toward two places, whose names would come to define the campaign: Imphal and Kohima. For months, patrols operating far from the main roads had sensed a change. Trails were busier. Supply dumps appeared where none had existed before. Japanese movement became more purposeful and coordinated. What emerged was Operation Yugo, an ambitious Japanese offensive aimed at crossing into northeast India, cutting Allied supply lines, and forcing a decisive battle on ground chosen by Japan. The plan relied on speed, surprise, and endurance. Japanese commanders believed that a rapid advance would allow their forces to live off captured Allied supplies. If Imphal and Kohima could be taken quickly, the British Indian Army would be forced into retreat, and the balance in Burma would shift again. It was a gamble that assumed discipline could overcome distance, and that momentum could replace logistics. As Japanese forces advanced between March and July 1944, the campaign expanded beyond dispersed patrols into sieges and intense fighting. Imphal became a contested basin, while Kohima turned into a desperate struggle along narrow ridgelines. These battles would later dominate official histories. Yet much of the campaign unfolded away from these main positions, in the spaces between roads and strongpoints. There, the shadow war continued. Gurkha units operated within this broader effort as part of a layered defense. They were not independent raiders acting alone, but elements of a system designed to slow, confuse, and weaken the enemy. Patrols moved along jungle tracks, ridges, and river crossings to observe Japanese movement, harass supply columns, and report concentrations. Their task was not to stop the offensive outright. That responsibility lay with larger formations, but to deny the Japanese freedom of movement. Delay became decisive. In jungle terrain, every mile demanded effort. A single disrupted supply route could cost days. Patrols targeted vulnerable points, narrow trails, temporary bridges, and areas where terrain forced Japanese columns to compress. Ambushes were planned carefully, with withdrawal routes identified in advance. The goal was not destruction, but disruption. A delayed column burned calories, consumed rations, and lost momentum. Japanese logistics soon began to show strain. The U-Go plan depended on capturing Allied depots, but these were defended or destroyed before capture. Patrol reports noted signs of growing desperation, abandoned heavy equipment, reduced rations, and increased foraging. Japanese soldiers carried lighter loads than expected. Improvised camps appeared near villages and water sources. These observations, gathered by small units operating quietly, fed into Allied assessments. Intelligence from patrols did not arrive as dramatic revelations. It came as fragments, dates, estimates, patterns. A trail that was busy one week was empty the next. A unit seen moving south appeared later moving north. These details, when combined at higher levels, helped commanders understand where the offensive was losing strength and where it remained dangerous. Without such information, artillery, airstrikes, and troop movements would have been far less precise. For the men on patrol, the tempo changed sharply. Enemy presence increased. Contact became more frequent and less avoidable. Japanese counter-patrolling intensified as they attempted to secure their supply lines. Ambushes were tighter, withdrawals were faster and more urgent. Mistakes carried greater consequences. A delayed movement or a missed signal could expose an entire unit. The environment remained unforgiving. Monsoon rains arrived early, turning tracks into mud and rivers into barriers. Air supply became harder as cloud cover thickened and drop zones flooded. Illness spiked again under constant stress and damp conditions. Endurance, already strained by months of operations, was now demanded at a higher level. Despite this pressure, Allied defences held. Imphal was supplied by air on a massive scale, preventing collapse. Kohima, though nearly cut off, resisted until relief arrived. Japanese units, stretched thin and underfed, began to lose cohesion. Patrol encounters reflected this shift. Japanese movements grew cautious, then hesitant. Some units avoided contact entirely, choosing concealment over engagement. For Gurkha patrols operating beyond the main defences, the change was sensed before it was announced. Trails that had once been crowded fell silent. Camps were abandoned hastily. Equipment was left behind. The jungle, previously tense with activity, grew quieter in places. This silence was uneven and dangerous, but it signaled a turning point. As the Japanese offensive stalled, its weaknesses became visible. Units advanced too far, too fast, without a secure supply. Allied air power and artillery intensified pressure. What had begun as a bold gamble turned into a slow collapse. Japanese forces attempted a withdrawal under constant harassment, suffering heavy losses from hunger, disease, and exhaustion. When the battles of Imphal and Kohima ended, they were recognized as decisive moments in the Burma Campaign. Japanese forces had been checked and broken, yet the outcome was not shaped only by what happened on the ridges and roads that later entered history books. It was also shaped by months of unseen effort, by patrols that delayed, observed, and endured in the margins. For those involved in the Shadow War, victory brought no immediate relief. The work did not stop when the offensive failed. Patrols continued to monitor withdrawal routes, identify weakened units, and prevent regrouping. The enemy was retreating, but still dangerous. The jungle allowed escape as easily as advance. With the offensive defeated, the balance of initiative shifted decisively. The question was no longer whether Allied forces could hold India, but how, and how far they would push back into Burma. For Gurkha units and others trained for dispersed operations, this raised a new challenge. The war was changing again. The skills learned in isolation, patience, discipline, autonomy had been suited to defense and disruption. Now they would have to support advance. The Shadow War had shaped the outcome of the battles for Imphal and Kohima, but it was not the final phase. The jungle that had once concealed retreat and resistance would soon witness a slow, deliberate return. And once more, adaptation would decide who endured. Victory did not arrive as a sudden release. After Imphal and Kohima, it came slowly, measured in miles reclaimed and time endured. In late 1944, Allied forces began the long return into Burma, advancing across ground shaped by years of fighting, neglect and withdrawal. The jungle that had once concealed movement now revealed the marks of collapse, abandoned positions, rusted equipment, and villages altered by shortage and displacement. The campaign shifted again, and with it, the role of those who had learned to fight without a visible front. The transition from long-range penetration to deliberate advance was uneven. Large formations moved forward along several axes, supported by air supply and engineering units tasked with repairing roads, bridges, and airstrips. Yet terrain still resisted control. Rivers dictated timing. Hills broke the momentum. Even during advance, there was no continuous line, only expanding pockets of influence. Patrols remained essential, not as raiders, but as scouts and screens, ensuring that movement did not outrun understanding. Gurkha units increasingly returned to conventional infantry roles, but the habits formed during earlier phases did not disappear. Patrol work remained central. Before columns advanced, routes were checked carefully, flanks were watched, movement was paced rather than rushed. Night movement continued where daylight offered too much exposure. What had been learned in isolation now shaped how units advanced as part of a larger force. The environment remained demanding, roads were scarce or damaged. Supply still depended heavily on air transport, especially in areas where engineering progress lagged. Rations were more reliable than earlier in the war, but shortages persisted at the edges of the advance. Disease declined somewhat with better organization and experience, yet fatigue accumulated. Many soldiers carried lingering illnesses or injuries that reduced endurance without removing them from duty. Civilians began to reappear along advance routes, often cautiously. Villages that had emptied during years of fighting showed signs of return. Fields were partially tended. Structures were repaired using scavenged materials. The presence of civilians added complexity. Intelligence now involved understanding how war had reshaped local life, who remained, who had fled, and who might provide information under pressure. Units were instructed to move carefully, recognizing that stability mattered as much as speed. Japanese resistance during this phase was uneven. Some units fought hard to delay the advance, using terrain to inflict losses before withdrawing. Others avoided contact, conserving strength or lacking the means to fight. Patrol encounters reflected this inconsistency. Short clashes were followed by long stretches of silence. The enemy no longer pressed from all directions, but the danger had not vanished. Commanders faced a familiar dilemma, now reversed. Advancing too quickly risked overextension, repeating the mistakes of 1942 in the opposite direction. Advancing too slowly risked allowing Japanese forces to regroup or withdraw intact. The solution lay in coordination rather than momentum, advancing in phases, securing key terrain and maintaining pressure without losing coherence. This methodical approach reflected lessons learned through failure earlier in the campaign. For units experienced in operating behind enemy lines, this phase required adjustment. Autonomy remained important, but now it fed into a system capable of rapid response. Patrol leaders who had once acted in isolation now passed information upward to headquarters that could act decisively. The jungle still limited certainty, but it no longer dictated every outcome. The war's physical traces grew more visible as the advance continued. Abandoned Japanese positions revealed shortages, empty ration tins, makeshift shelters, equipment stripped for parts. Signs of exhaustion were everywhere. Intelligence reports described units operating without coordination, relying on local resources that no longer existed. Yet even in collapse, resistance flared unpredictably. Small engagements continued to claim lives far from any decisive moment. As 1945 approached, momentum clearly favored the Allies. Airfields were repaired, supply improved, Japanese morale weakened, yet the end did not arrive cleanly. The jungle absorbed the retreat quietly. Units disappeared into the forest rather than surrendering openly. Patrols remained cautious, aware that desperation could still produce sudden violence. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the news reached forward units unevenly. Some received official orders days later, others sensed the change through absence. no movement on trails, no response to patrol probes. The jungle fell quiet in a way it had not for years. The advance had succeeded, but it left questions behind. What had been achieved over years of dispersed fighting did not easily translate into single victories or dramatic scenes. There were no fixed lines crossed, no final charges that captured the experience of patrols, scouts, and small unit leaders who had shaped the campaign's margins. Their contribution was spread across time and space, present without being singular. As units halted and preparations for demobilization began, attention shifted from movement to memory. The war was over, but the meaning of what had been done, especially in the spaces beyond the front, remained unsettled. What it meant to fight behind enemy lines would soon be reconsidered, not in the jungle, but in how the campaign was later described and remembered. When the war ended, it did not conclude with a spectacle in the jungle. There were no parades along forest tracks, no clear moment when danger dissolved into relief. Units stood down gradually, equipment was collected, inspected, and turned in. Men who had spent years moving through the jungle, uncertainty and isolation were returned to camps, then to barracks, and eventually home. The irregular war fought in fragments, without fixed fronts, did not lend itself easily to ceremony. What followed was silence, and then the problem of meaning. Demobilization reduced complex campaigns into brief summaries. Official histories focused on major battles, supply figures, and command decisions. Maps showed arrows and objectives, timelines listed offensives and outcomes. The work of dispersed patrols appeared mostly in appendices, footnotes, or after-action reports. Their experience resisted compression. It did not fit cleanly into the categories used to explain victory. For Gurkha units, this compression was especially sharp. Their wartime role had shifted repeatedly: conventional infantry during retreat, long-range patrols during disruption, screening forces during advance. These transitions were practical responses to changing conditions, not part of a single design. Yet memory often prefers clear labels. The phrase "behind enemy lines" offered one, even if it simplified more than it explained. In popular imagination, operating behind enemy lines suggested daring isolation and constant combat. In reality, it meant something quieter and more demanding. It meant operating without certainty. It meant accepting that isolation was not an exception, but normal. Patrols did not act independently out of heroism, but because conditions left no alternative. Their effectiveness depended on systems, air supply, intelligence networks, medical discipline, and command restraint, as much as individual skill. Post-war assessments reflected this restraint. Military reports acknowledged the value of long-range patrols and penetration operations, but avoided claims of decisive impact. Sabotage disrupted movement, but rarely determined outcomes on its own. Intelligence shaped decisions, but only when combined with air power and conventional force. The jungle did not reward exaggeration, it exposed it. What these operations did provide was time. Time for defenses to stabilize, time for logistics to adapt, time for larger forces to concentrate and respond. The value of patrols lay not in what they destroyed, but in what they prevented. Unopposed movement, unchecked supply, and strategic surprise. Their success was often invisible, measured in delays rather than victories. For the men involved, this invisibility shaped memory. There were a few clear moments to point to as defining achievements. Success was cumulative and often recognized only in hindsight. Failure, by contrast, was immediate and personal. A missed movement, a lost drop, or a poor decision carried direct consequences. Responsibility rested heavily on small unit leaders whose decisions were rarely visible beyond their patrol. Within the British Indian Army, the Burma Campaign came to be understood as a war of adaptation. No single innovation changed its course. Instead, progress emerged from many small changes. Training methods revised, logistics reorganized, command expectations adjusted. Gurkha soldiers operating behind enemy lines were part of this process. Their contribution was not unique because of origin or reputation, but because of consistency. They operated within a system that demanded discipline more than spectacle. This understanding shaped post-war military thinking. The campaign reinforced the importance of small unit leadership, endurance, and autonomy in complex terrain. These lessons would later inform the development of special operations forces and doctrines emphasizing mobility and initiative. Yet even here, the influence was indirect. The Burma experience was rarely copied in its entirety. Its value lay in principles rather than templates. For Gurkha units, the legacy was collective rather than individual. Their wartime experience strengthened a reputation built on professionalism rather than mystique. They were not naturally suited to jungle warfare by nature alone, but by training, organization, and command. Their effectiveness came from adherence to routine under conditions that punished error relentlessly. Memory, however, tends to simplify. Over time, routines became stories. Necessary restraint became assumed bravery. Quiet endurance hardened into legend. In these retellings, systems faded into the background, and individuals moved to the foreground. What was lost was the central truth of the Burma Campaign, that success was achieved through sustained, disciplined effort, rather than isolated heroism. To understand what behind enemy lines really meant in Burma is to look past the phrase itself. It meant operating without reliable maps. It meant planning for failure rather than success. It meant making decisions whose effects would not be visible for days, or at all. It meant accepting that withdrawal was not defeat, and that survival was sometimes the highest objective. It also meant restraint. Patrols were not free to act as they wished. Targets were chosen carefully. Engagements were avoided when the cost outweighed the benefit. Discipline mattered more than aggression. In an environment where every bullet, step, and calorie counted, excess was punished quickly. Above all, it meant endurance, physical, organizational, and moral. Physical endurance allowed movement through terrain that resisted every step. Organizational endurance allowed systems to function despite loss and delay. Moral endurance allowed men to continue operating without clear recognition or closure. This endurance was not dramatic, it was repetitive and demanding. The war in Burma ended quietly in the jungle. Trails emptied, camps were abandoned, patrols ceased, vegetation closed over paths that had been used daily. What remained was not a single story, but a pattern of adaptation under pressure, of soldiers shaped by environment as much as by enemy. In that pattern, the Gurkhas were neither myth nor exception. They were professionals operating where the front could not be drawn, and where success was measured not by conquest but by persistence. The phrase "behind enemy lines" suggests distance from the center of war. In Burma, it described something closer to its core, a form of fighting where certainty disappeared, systems mattered, and survival itself became the measure of achievement. The legacy of that experience is not found in monuments or dramatic claims. It lies in lessons learned quietly about how wars are sustained, how environments shape outcomes, and how discipline endures when visibility fades. Those lessons outlasted the jungle. They traveled forward into doctrine, training, and memory. The Gurkhas did not define the war in Burma alone, but in operating beyond the visible front, they revealed what modern war often demands: not boldness without limit, but endurance guided by judgment, carried out without expectation of recognition, and sustained long after certainty has vanished. These stories survive only when they're remembered, so help keep them alive. Like the video, subscribe for more grounded Opt-Op-UI documentaries, and share this with others who value history beyond myth. Your support helps us tell the quieter stories that shaped the war.